What if the giants of Genesis never truly vanished? What if their blood still moves through hidden bloodlines today, disguised, forgotten, but never erased? The Bible warned us. We just stopped listening. Genesis chapter 6 holds one of the strangest verses in the entire Bible, and most people read straight past it without ever stopping to ask what it truly means. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Not a metaphor, not poetry. A direct historical statement placed right before the story of the flood. And immediately after, the text says something even stranger. There were giants in the earth in those days. The Hebrew word used there is Nephilim, and it does not simply mean big men. It comes from a root that means the fallen ones. Fallen from where? That question alone should stop every reader in their tracks. Here is what almost nobody in mainstream teaching wants to sit with. The flood was not sent because humanity was merely wicked in a vague, general sense. Genesis 6 is specific. It ties the coming judgment directly to this union between heavenly beings and human women, and to the offspring that resulted from it. Whatever these Nephilim were, God considered their existence significant enough to wipe out nearly all life on earth to deal with it. That is not a small detail tucked into a genealogy. That is the reason given for one of the most catastrophic events in Scripture. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable for a lot of people, because if the flood was sent to erase this bloodline, and yet centuries later, in the book of Numbers, the Israelite spies returned from Canaan terrified, reporting that they saw giants there too. There we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers. Anak, the Anakim. Descendants of Nephilim, walking around in the land of Canaan long after the flood supposedly should have ended that bloodline forever. So the question becomes unavoidable. If the flood was meant to remove them from the earth, how were they still there generations later? The Book of Enoch, a text quoted directly in the New Testament by Jude, gives us details Genesis leaves out. It names 200 watchers who descended on Mount Hermon, a location so specific it can be found on a map today. It names their leader, Shemi-Haza, and it describes their offspring as violent, consuming, and eventually turning on humanity and on each other. Enoch describes them as beings whose bodies died in conflict, but whose spirits did not simply cease to exist. The spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and cause destruction on the earth. Read that again. Their bodies were destroyed. Their spirits were not. This detail matters more than most people realize, because it opens a door that Scripture never fully closes. If the physical giants were killed off in the flood and in the later conquests of Canaan, but something of their nature persisted, whether through surviving remnant bloodlines, through spiritual influence, or through both, then the story of the Nephilim is not a closed chapter from an ancient world. It is an ongoing thread woven through the entire narrative of the Bible, one that keeps resurfacing in Numbers, in Deuteronomy, in Joshua, and even, some scholars argue, in the strange spiritual warfare language of the New Testament itself. Deuteronomy adds another layer to this. It describes multiple giant peoples scattered across the region, the Rephaim, the Zamzumim, the Emim, each with their own name, their own territory, their own terrifying reputation. That also was accounted a land of giants. Giants dwelt therein in old time, and the Ammonites called them Zamzumims. Why would Scripture bother naming so many distinct giant clans if this was simply one isolated, contained event? The pattern suggests something far more persistent than a single flood could erase. It suggests bloodlines that spread, adapted, and survived in more places than we were ever taught to imagine. There is also the matter of Og, king of Bashan, a figure Scripture treats with unusual precision. Deuteronomy does not simply call him large, it measures him. His bedstead was a bedstead of iron. 9 cubits was the length thereof, and 4 cubits the breadth of it, after the cubit of a man. That places his resting frame somewhere close to 13 feet long. Og is described as the last remaining survivor of the Rephaim, a giant clan that ruled entire kingdoms east of the Jordan. Not a myth passed down by frightened travelers. A named king with a named kingdom, defeated by Israel in a real recorded battle generations after the flood. If the Nephilim bloodline had truly ended in Noah's time, Scripture would have no reason to introduce a king centuries later, described in these exact terms. What makes this even harder to dismiss is the consistency across separate, independent sources. Genesis mentions them before the flood. Numbers reports the spies encountering their descendants in Canaan. Deuteronomy names their kingdoms and measures their king. Joshua records the campaigns fought to remove them from the land. This is not one strange verse floating alone in an obscure book. This is a thread pulled through 5 separate books of the Bible, written across centuries by different hands, all describing the same unsettling reality. A bloodline that should have ended but somehow kept reappearing. And this is precisely why so many researchers, theologians, and independent scholars have spent years asking a question. Institutional religion rarely wants to touch directly. Not whether the Nephilim existed, Scripture already answers that, but whether their bloodline or whatever spiritual residue they left behind could have continued far beyond the ancient world described in Joshua and Samuel. Whether what began on Mount Hermon before the flood never actually ended, but simply went quiet, hidden beneath centuries of retelling, mistranslation, and deliberate omission from the texts that made it into the final canon. If you feel that pull right now, that sense that there is more beneath the surface of these verses than you were ever taught in church, that feeling is worth trusting. Because everything explored in this video, every connection between Genesis, Numbers, Enoch, and the giant clans of Canaan, is laid out in far greater depth inside our premium illustrated guide, the Forbidden Book of Enoch, what it reveals about the Watchers, giants, and the world before the flood. It walks you through the entire suppressed history in a way no single video ever could, with illustrations that bring Mount Hermon, the Watchers, and the pre-flood world to life in front of your eyes. The link sits in the very first comment pinned right below this video, waiting for anyone who wants to go deeper than the surface. And if this is the kind of study that speaks to something in you, something that has been quietly searching for answers your church may have never addressed, take a moment now to subscribe to this channel. This is exactly the kind of hidden scripture we uncover here, week after week, piece by piece, together. To understand where this bloodline may have gone, we have to go back further than Canaan, further than the flood itself, to the moment the Book of Enoch claims it all began. 200 watchers, angelic beings assigned to observe creation, made a choice on the summit of Mount Hermon that Scripture treats as the single most consequential rebellion in human history. Enoch names their leader as Shemihazah and records the oath they swore together before descending, binding themselves to a plan they knew violated the order they were created to uphold. This was not a single angel falling in isolation. This was an organized descent, 200 beings acting in agreement, choosing human women deliberately, generation by generation. What resulted from these unions were not ordinary children. Enoch describes offspring of enormous size and appetite, creatures who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when human food could no longer satisfy them, the text says they turned on humanity itself. This is graphic language, deliberately so, because the author wanted readers to understand exactly how catastrophic this rebellion became. These were not misunderstood giants living peacefully at the margins of society. Thus, it describes a world being consumed from within by beings that should never have existed. Born from a union Scripture treats as a direct violation of the boundary between heaven and earth. Genesis 6 gives us the divine response in a single devastating sentence. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The flood was not simply a punishment for ordinary sin. It was, according to Enoch, an attempt to reset creation entirely, to erase a corruption that had spread through the bloodline of an entire region. And yet, if that erasure had been complete, the story should have ended there. Noah's family alone should have repopulated the earth with no trace of what came before, but that is not what the rest of Scripture shows us. The Book of Jubilees, another text well known to ancient Jewish and early Christian communities, expands on what happened immediately after the flood. It describes evil spirits, the disembodied remnants of the giants whose physical bodies were destroyed, continuing to trouble Noah's descendants. These spirits are described as leading humanity astray, teaching forbidden knowledge, and corrupting the generations that followed. If Jubilees is describing something real, then the bloodline's threat did not end with drowned bodies. It transformed into something harder to trace, harder to fight, and far more difficult to fully eliminate. This matches what we find later in Canaan. When Israel's spies return from scouting the Promised Land, their report is not vague fear of large men, it is specific. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. The phrase, which come of the giants, is doing enormous work in that sentence. It is a direct genealogical claim. These are not simply tall warriors. Scripture is telling us in plain language that these are descendants, a bloodline traced back to the very beings Genesis 6 introduced before the flood. The Anakim were not the only giant clan named in Scripture. Deuteronomy lists the Rephaim, associated with the region of Bashan, the Zamzumim, described as a people the Ammonites themselves feared and eventually displaced, and the Emim, whom Scripture says were as the Anakims in size and reputation. Each of these names represents a separate, distinct people group spread across different territories, all carrying the same unmistakable characteristics. This is not folklore repeating itself by coincidence. This is the pattern of a bloodline that survived, scattered, and re-established itself in multiple locations across the ancient Near East. Some scholars have pointed to something even stranger tucked into these accounts: the consistent emphasis on their size, their strength, and their reputation for terrifying entire nations suggests these were not simply large humans born through ordinary genetics. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, wrote about giants possessing bodies so massive and voices so different from ordinary men that they were instantly recognizable wherever they appeared. If Josephus, writing centuries after the events in Canaan, still felt the need to describe these beings in such specific terms, it suggests the memory of what they truly were had not faded, even generations later. And this raises the uncomfortable question sitting beneath the entire chapter. If a flood could not fully erase this bloodline, if Canaan still had to be cleared of it centuries later through direct military campaigns commanded by God himself, what actually happened to what remained after Joshua's conquest was finished? Scripture records specific victories. It records Og's defeat. It records David facing Goliath, another descendant of this same giant lineage, generations after Canaan was supposedly cleared. But Scripture never explicitly states that every trace, every remnant, every hidden line of this bloodline was accounted for. Consider David and Goliath more closely for a moment, because most people treat this story as a simple tale of courage against a large opponent, when Scripture is actually giving us something far more precise. Goliath is identified as being from Gath, one of the specific cities where the remnant of the Anakim was said to have survived after Joshua's campaigns. And there was none of the Anakims left in the land of the children of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod there remained. Read that sentence carefully. Scripture is admitting, in plain terms, that Joshua's conquest did not eliminate this bloodline entirely. Pockets of it survived, deliberately named, deliberately preserved in the text, in 3 specific Philistine cities. Goliath was not an anomaly. He was the expected outcome of a lineage Scripture had already told us was still alive. And Goliath was not alone. 2 Samuel records at least 4 more giant warriors from Gath specifically, one with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, another carrying a spear compared to a weaver's beam. These are not throwaway details. They are consistent physical markers, repeated across multiple giant figures, described by multiple authors centuries apart. A pattern like that does not emerge from folklore. It emerges from something Scripture's authors understood as continuing biological reality, a bloodline with distinct, recognizable repeating traits that outlasted the flood, outlasted Canaan, and was still walking the earth in the time of King David. That silence is exactly where so much of the ongoing mystery lives, not in what the Bible confirms, but in what it leaves unresolved, unfinished, and quietly unanswered as the narrative moves forward into the era of kings, prophets, and eventually into the New Testament itself. By the time we reach the New Testament, the language shifts, but the underlying concern never fully disappears. Jude, writing centuries after Joshua cleared the giant cities of Canaan, still felt compelled to reference this exact rebellion directly. And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. Jude is not speaking in vague terms about generic sin. He is referencing a specific well-known event, one his readers would have immediately recognized, tied directly to the Watchers and their descent on Mount Hermon. 2 Peter echoes this same reference. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment. Two separate New Testament authors, writing to two separate audiences, both assume their readers already understand exactly what rebellion they are describing. This tells us something important. The early church did not treat the Genesis 6 account as an obscure footnote. They treated it as foundational enough to reference without explanation, the same way you might mention a well-known historical event today without needing to summarize the whole story first. And if the rebellion itself remained significant enough to reference in the New Testament, it becomes far more plausible that its consequences, the bloodline it produced, were understood as an ongoing spiritual reality rather than a closed, ancient incident with no lasting effect. Paul's language in Ephesians adds another layer worth sitting with. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Some researchers argue this verse carries far more weight than a general statement about temptation. The specific mention of rulers, powers, and spiritual wickedness organized in a hierarchy mirrors the very structure Enoch describes among the fallen watchers themselves, a chain of command, named leaders, organized rebellion. If Paul understood spiritual conflict in these terms, it suggests the framework introduced in Genesis 6, expanded in Enoch, never actually closed. It simply moved from a physical battlefield into a spiritual one. This is where many independent researchers begin connecting threads that institutional teaching rarely explores publicly. If the physical giants were largely eliminated through the conquests recorded in Joshua and Samuel, but the spiritual influence behind their existence continued, as Jubilees suggests, then the bloodline's disappearance from Scripture's narrative does not necessarily mean its disappearance from history. It may simply mean the story shifted from something Scripture tracked explicitly, physical giants in named cities, to something Scripture only gestures toward, hidden spiritual influence operating beneath the surface of later civilizations. And this is precisely where ancient sites outside the biblical text start to matter. Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey predates Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years, built by a civilization that, according to conventional timelines, should not have possessed the organizational capacity, the tools, or the architectural knowledge to construct it. Massive carved stone pillars, some weighing over 10 tons, arranged with clear intention, built by people archaeologists still cannot fully explain. Baalbek in Lebanon contains stones in its foundation so massive, some estimated at 800 tons, that modern engineering would struggle to move them even today. Ancient writers associated Baalbek with giants long before modern archaeology ever excavated the site. Consider Puma Punku in Bolivia more closely, because the details here are genuinely difficult to dismiss as ordinary ancient craftsmanship. The site contains precisely cut andesite blocks, an extremely hard volcanic stone shaped with interlocking joints so exact that modern stonemasons using contemporary tools have struggled to replicate them. Some of these stones were transported from quarries located many miles away, across difficult terrain, by a culture conventional history insists had no wheel, no draft animals capable of the task, and no metal tools hard enough to cut the stone with this level of precision. Local Aymara oral tradition, predating European contact, describes the site as built not by ordinary men, but by a race of giants who existed before the current age of humanity. This is not a modern embellishment added for entertainment. It is a tradition that existed long before archaeologists ever arrived to study the ruins. Tiwanaku, located near Puma Punku, tells a similar story. Its massive stone gateways, its precisely aligned solar architecture, and its advanced understanding of astronomy point to a level of organizational sophistication that conventional timelines struggle to fully account for. And Sacsayhuaman in Peru presents perhaps the most striking example of all. Its walls are built from stones weighing well over 100 tons each, fitted together with such precision that even today, a knife blade cannot slide between the joints, all without mortar, all shaped to interlock perfectly despite their irregular polygonal forms. Spanish chroniclers who arrived centuries later recorded local legends insisting the site had been built not by the Inca themselves, but by a race of giants who came before them, beings the Inca revered and feared in equal measure. What makes these accounts so difficult to simply dismiss is their consistency across cultures with no meaningful contact with one another. A Peruvian legend about giant builders and a Mesopotamian account of the Anunnaki did not originate from the same storytellers, the same trade routes, or the same shared mythology. And yet the underlying claim that something larger, older, and more capable than ordinary humanity once walked the earth and left behind structures beyond conventional explanation repeats itself across nearly every ancient civilization we have record of. Josephus himself wrote that these ancient beings were remembered by nearly every culture that recorded their earliest history, described in different languages under different names, yet carrying the same essential characteristics of size, strength, and a knowledge that seemed to exceed what ordinary humans of that era were believed capable of possessing. A memory this widespread, surviving independently across oceans and unconnected civilizations, is not easily explained away as isolated coincidence repeating itself by accident. The Sibylline Oracles, a body of prophetic writings referenced by several early church figures, describe giants persisting in various forms long after the flood, embedding themselves into the mythologies of surrounding cultures under different names. Greek mythology remembers them as titans. Norse tradition remembers giant beings shaping the earliest cosmology of their world. Mesopotamian texts describe the Anunnaki, powerful beings who came down and interacted directly with early humanity. Different names, different cultures, remarkably similar core details. A civilization emerging from a global memory, this consistent does not typically produce coincidence on this scale. There is a passage in Genesis that most readers skip past entirely, treating it as a strange, almost throwaway detail, when it may actually be one of the most important clues in the entire account. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. Notice the phrasing carefully. Not before that, also after that. Scripture is explicitly telling us this was not a single event confined to one generation before the flood. It happened again afterward, the same pattern, the same union, repeating itself in a world that was supposed to have already been cleansed of it. This single line reframes everything we think we understand about the timeline. If the rebellion on Mount Hermon happened once, produced the pre-flood Nephilim, and ended completely with the flood, Genesis would have no reason to add that qualifying phrase. But it does add it deliberately, and that detail alone suggests the biblical authors understood something researchers today are only beginning to take seriously. Whatever mechanism produced these hybrid beings was not a one-time historical accident. It was a pattern capable of repeating, resurfacing, and re-establishing itself whenever conditions allowed. This is where the conversation shifts from ancient history into something far more unsettling. Because if the pattern could repeat once after the flood, producing the Anakim, the Rephaim, and the giant clans of Canaan, there is no scriptural guarantee that it stopped there permanently. The Bible tracks what happened to the physical giants because physical giants were visible, measurable, and directly relevant to Israel's military conquests. But Scripture was never written as a comprehensive record of every spiritual and genetic thread moving through human history. It was written to record God's covenant relationship with a specific people, in a specific land, during a specific period. Anything happening outside that narrow lens simply was not the author's priority to document. This is precisely the gap that ancient extra-biblical texts attempt to fill. The Genesis Apocryphon, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, describes Lamech, Noah's own father, experiencing genuine fear that his newborn son did not look fully human, suspecting the Watchers may have influenced his own household before the flood ever occurred. Whether or not that specific suspicion was accurate, the text reveals something important. Even Noah's immediate family lived with the anxiety that this corruption could infiltrate any bloodline at any time, without obvious warning. If that fear existed within Noah's own household, why would we assume it disappeared entirely from every household that followed him? The Aramaic Book of Giants, another Dead Sea Scrolls fragment, gives us the perspective of the giants themselves, describing their own troubled dreams and their dawning awareness that judgment was coming for what their fathers, the Watchers, had done. This text treats the giants not as mindless monsters, but as beings caught in a conflict they did not fully choose, born into a corruption that originated with their parentage rather than their own decisions. That detail matters, because it suggests the bloodline itself carried a kind of spiritual burden, something passed down rather than something chosen fresh in each generation. The same way physical or spiritual inheritance passes through any bloodline across history. Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, an ancient Aramaic translation and commentary on the Torah, goes even further, explicitly naming two of the Watchers, Shamhazai and Azael, and describing their continued spiritual influence long after their physical judgment. According to this tradition, their corruption did not end neatly with the flood. It persisted, woven into practices, knowledge systems, and spiritual deception that continued shaping human civilization for generations afterward. If ancient Jewish scholars, studying scripture centuries before modern researchers ever picked up this thread, already suspected this influence had not fully ended, that suspicion deserves serious consideration rather than dismissal. Put these pieces together, Genesis' own admission that the pattern repeated after the flood, Lamech's private fear for his newborn son, the Book of Giants describing an inherited spiritual burden, and Targum Pseudo-Jonathan's claim of continued influence long after judgment, and a very different picture begins to form. Not a closed ancient story with a clean resolution, but an ongoing thread scripture itself hints was never fully severed. One that the biblical authors chose not to fully document, perhaps because it was never meant to be fully documented, only recognized by those willing to look closely enough at what was left unsaid. Job, one of the oldest books in Scripture, contains language many researchers connect to this same lingering presence. Dead things are formed from under the waters, and the inhabitants thereof. Hell is naked before him, and destruction hath no covering. The Hebrew word translated here as dead things, Rephaim, is the exact same word used elsewhere to describe the giant clan defeated in Bashan. Job seems to be describing something beneath the earth, something associated with these beings, existing in a state neither fully alive nor fully gone, hidden from ordinary sight, but not entirely erased from existence. Isaiah uses the same word again, describing the Rephaim as shades stirring beneath the earth to greet a fallen king, language that treats this bloodline's spiritual remnant as something Scripture's own poets understood to persist long after their physical bodies had died. If Job and Isaiah, two prophetic voices separated by centuries, both reach for this same specific term to describe something lingering beneath the visible world, it becomes increasingly difficult to treat the Nephilim bloodline as a fully closed chapter. Scripture itself seems to leave a door open, deliberately or not, suggesting that whatever began on Mount Hermon left behind more than buried bones in Canaanite soil. Psalms carries a related warning, one easy to read past without noticing its weight. For all the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. Many ancient Near Eastern deities worshipped by surrounding nations were not simply invented myths with no basis at all. Some researchers argue these figures represent exactly the kind of spiritual beings Enoch and Jubilees describe, remembered, renamed, and eventually worshipped by cultures that had lost the original context of what they were actually encountering. If that connection holds any weight, then the bloodline's influence did not simply vanish into silence. It may have been absorbed, reshaped, and preserved under entirely different names across the ancient world. Hidden in plain sight within religious systems, Scripture explicitly warns God's people to avoid, worshipped under new titles by people who never realized what or who they were truly bowing before. Jesus himself, speaking directly to his disciples about the final days before his return, chose a comparison that should stop us cold when we actually sit with it. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Not a vague reference to general wickedness, a specific, deliberate comparison to the exact conditions Genesis 6 describes. the same period when the Watchers descended, when the Nephilim walked the earth, when the corruption of that bloodline had spread so completely that judgment became the only remaining option. If Jesus chose this particular comparison for the end times, rather than any other moment in Scripture he could have selected, that choice deserves far more attention than it typically receives in mainstream teaching. Why would the conditions of Noah's day be the model for the last days, unless something about that specific corruption was expected to return? Or perhaps, according to what we have already traced through Genesis, Jubilees, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, never fully left in the first place. Revelation reinforces this same pattern using different imagery. It describes locust-like beings emerging from the abyss during the tribulation, creatures with human faces, the strength to torment humanity, and a king ruling over them called Abaddon, the Destroyer. Some researchers connect this directly to the imprisoned spirits Enoch describes, the disembodied remnant of the giants, bound beneath the earth, awaiting a final release that Revelation seems to describe in vivid, unmistakable detail. This pattern, ancient corruption, temporary restraint, and eventual release, appears again in Revelation's description of the bottomless pit itself, sealed with a key, opened only when the time appointed for judgment finally arrives. Jude's earlier reference to angels, reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day, matches this imagery with striking precision. Two separate books, written decades apart, describing the same imprisoned beings, the same anticipated release, the same connection back to the original rebellion on Mount Hermon. This is not coincidental language. This is a consistent thread running from Genesis all the way through to the final chapters of Scripture. If this framework holds any weight, the question shifts from whether this bloodline once existed. Scripture has already answered that clearly, towards something far more immediate. What would evidence of its continued presence actually look like today, in a world that no longer names giants openly the way Numbers and Deuteronomy once did? Independent researchers point towards several persistent patterns worth genuine consideration. Certain bloodlines throughout history, tracing back through royal and aristocratic lines in the ancient Near East, the Mediterranean and beyond, carried consistent claims of divine or semi-divine origin, ancestry deliberately connected back to beings who were said to have descended from the heavens. Whether these claims were literal or simply used to justify political power, their persistence across cultures with no direct communication with one another is difficult to explain as mere coincidence. Genetic anomalies documented throughout recorded history, individuals born with unusual height, unusual bone structure, or unusual physical characteristics matching the ancient descriptions we explored earlier, continue appearing in the historical and even modern medical record, far more frequently than pure statistical randomness would predict in isolated cases. This does not prove a direct unbroken bloodline extending into the present day, and any responsible researcher should be careful not to overstate what remains, ultimately, circumstantial evidence. But it does suggest that whatever genetic or spiritual mechanism produced these ancient anomalies did not vanish entirely from human history the moment Joshua's conquest concluded. There is also the matter of hidden knowledge, the specific detail Enoch emphasizes as one of the Watcher's primary sins. And Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them. The Watchers are described not simply as beings who corrupted humanity through unlawful unions, but as beings who deliberately transmitted advanced knowledge, metallurgy, astrology, and enchantments humanity was never meant to possess before it was spiritually ready for it. If that transmission of forbidden knowledge represents part of this bloodline's lasting legacy, its influence would not necessarily require an unbroken physical lineage to persist. It could persist through ideas, practices, and hidden systems of knowledge passed down and reshaped across thousands of years. Systems some researchers argue still echo through esoteric and occult traditions studied quietly today. None of this offers a tidy, fully resolved conclusion, and it should not pretend to. What it offers instead is a pattern Scripture itself refuses to fully close, a bloodline introduced in Genesis, tracked through Numbers and Deuteronomy, referenced directly by Jude and Peter, and echoed in the very imagery Jesus and John chose to describe the world's final days. Whatever began on Mount Hermon before the flood was never presented in Scripture as a fully closed, fully finished story. It was presented as a wound in creation, still waiting for its final resolution. Consider, too, how many of history's most secretive societies and hidden orders claimed access to knowledge they insisted originated from a source older than recorded civilization itself. Knowledge tied to fallen angels, ancient builders, or beings who walked the earth before the flood. Freemasonic tradition, certain Gnostic sects, and various esoteric orders across centuries have referenced Enochian wisdom directly by name, incorporating symbols and rituals they claimed traced back to knowledge Enoch himself received, or knowledge the Watchers themselves transmitted before judgment fell upon them. Whether these claims hold any literal truth is impossible to verify with certainty, but their persistence, spanning centuries, spanning continents, all pointing back toward the same original source described in Genesis 6, suggests this story never fully faded from human memory, even as it moved into the shadows of hidden orders rather than open public teaching. This is exactly why so many people today feel an unexplainable pull toward this subject, a sense that something ancient and unfinished is still quietly unfolding beneath the surface of ordinary history, waiting for those willing to look past the comfortable version of the story they were handed as children. Daniel offers one final, striking image worth holding onto here. His vision of the great statue, its head of gold, its feet of iron mixed with clay, describes kingdoms that will not fully cling together, even as iron is not mixed with clay. Some researchers argue this final kingdom, this mixing that refuses to hold, echoes the same unnatural mixing described in Genesis 6, an attempt to blend what was never meant to be blended, appearing again in the very last kingdom before God's own kingdom is established forever. If Daniel's prophecy carries even a shadow of that connection, then the story of the Nephilim bloodline does not simply belong to the ancient past. It belongs to the very end of the story Scripture is still telling. The bloodline Scripture warned us about was never fully closed, only hidden, waiting for eyes willing enough to see it. If this journey through Genesis, Enoch, and the ruins of forgotten civilizations stirred something in you, our premium illustrated guide, the Forbidden Book of Enoch, takes you even deeper into the Watchers, the Giants, and the world before the flood, link pinned in the first comment. Thank you for watching all the way to this final word. Subscribe to walk this path with us further. Like this video, leave a comment telling us what struck you most, and stay close because the next hidden truth is already waiting on your screen.